you guys, welcome back to another video. Thank you all so much who has been supporting the past couple of videos I put out, and for all of you who made 100 subscribers possible. I am really grateful for all of you who are here, and I look forward to making videos for you all and continuing to do that. Today I wanted to talk about purity culture and just kind of delve into that a little bit, as I know it's been a topic that's been discussed a lot by Christians and former Christians alike. So I just wanted to contribute a little to that discussion today. So in preparing for this video, I wanted to find a clear definition for purity culture just to define towards the end of the video. I didn't find anything super specific or very precise. It varies a little bit depending on like where you're reading or looking this up from. But I'm going to just say, for the purpose of this video, when I'm talking about purity culture, I'm talking about the movement popularized in the 80s, 90s into the 2000s that pushed for purity and chastity in men and women, saving sex only for marriage, and seeing sex and your engagement with it or lack thereof as defining your worth or value and how you move in the world. So shame and purity culture. I think the reason there is just an enormous amount of shame that people have experienced as a result of being a part of purity culture was that purity culture, in essence, really not only told people that sex in any capacity outside of marriage was bad, but also when you make a claim like that about someone's ability to have sex and you make that a shameful thing, that has implications for someone's sexuality, their sexual desires, and how they feel about the whole realm of being sexual, right? And that's also going to further have implications for how someone feels about themselves, especially their physical self, because our sexuality, our physicality are very interconnected. And so whether it was the intended consequence or not of purity culture, what really seemed to stem from this purity and chastity programming was a lot of people feeling so much shame, not only about having sex or not having it, and about our sexuality, but also about our bodies and physical selves. It led to a divorce from one's body and mind. You needed to keep control over your desires and urges. And in so doing that, to the extreme that purity culture pushed for, it led to a disconnect from one's own body. Instead of embracing and being in tune with just the natural desires that most people have when it comes to sex and sexuality, it taught you to repress those things, and to repress them because they're bad, they're unchaste, they're sinful, and even so much as having thoughts occur to you could be sinful if you didn't shut them down or repress them right away. And I wanted to talk about how purity culture really affected men and women in different but complementary ways. On the one hand, purity culture for women really seemed to put a lot of the responsibility on women, which, to be fair, this did not stem directly from purity culture. This is the result of what I believe to be thousands of years of indoctrination of putting moral responsibility heavily on women and telling them they need to be the moral gatekeepers of society. They need to be the gatekeepers of their own body, but it's not the same for men. It's just women need to be held to that standard. So if a couple has sex outside of marriage, for example, essentially the ideas within purity culture put the responsibility on the woman to not let that happen, to respect herself, to think of herself as better than engaging in that sort of behavior. And so on one hand, purity culture really told women that if a man desires you, objectifies you, and so on and so forth, that is in part your responsibility. And many women expose these sort of ideas, purity culture, along with a lot of modesty messages, because that was also very popular around the same time. Being modest became almost this trendy thing, and I still see some like more traditional or conservative influencers who will do this. Not to criticize that inherently, but the whole modesty thing became this countercultural trend. It definitely was when I was like growing up and as a teenager. And so the idea of modesty, depending on one's definition or how one practices it, often puts the responsibility of a woman being respected or being seen as more than an object is put on the woman, and it absolves any men or other people who might objectify or disrespect her, because if she wants respect, she needs to present herself in a way that commands that respect, and there's no responsibility whatsoever on men who might be engaging in that behavior, which of course ignores situations where women might be, from a societal perspective, perfectly presentable and appropriate, and they're still objectified all the time. But ideas like this within purity culture and in pushing for modesty don't really acknowledge those situations. They just probably would blame the woman anyway, and I saw that like just throughout, especially my teenage years, growing up amid all of these ideas. So those are a lot of the things that affected women. It was kind of the script for women, and with maintaining this purity and chastity is you need to be the gatekeepers of morality. You need to prevent this from happening. You need to present yourself in ways where men are not allowed to objectify you, which again, of course, doesn't really align with reality, because if someone wants to objectify you, you can't stop that. But again, that's just touching on a whole bunch of other things. So that's the woman's role essentially within purity culture. Now for the men's, on the other side of this, what I find to be really sad, and this would go for what I just said about purity culture and how it affected women, but for men in particular, what I found to be so sad about this sort of messaging for young men is these sort of ideas were presented to and continue to be presented to a lot of boys or young men who are likely just becoming acquainted with their sexuality, with very natural desires that are continuing to develop, and they're becoming more aware of just that whole new realm or dimension of who they are. And in that very vulnerable time, when someone is not comfortable yet with their sexuality and all these new desires and thoughts and feelings because they're adolescent, along comes purity culture, and it's telling men essentially that once your desires or attraction for someone takes over, there's no stopping it, and it's like you don't have control over yourself once that's happens and you're in that situation. Like, men have no control over what they do once they're in that headspace. And so this really ends up hypersexualizing men, like all men, and it paints this picture of male sexuality being universally aggressive, which I find to be very sad, because I think that in itself can lead to a lot of men really internalizing that. And when you're told, that your sexuality is aggressive, it's almost dangerous inherently, and you're going to possibly hurt women just by engaging with it. That's a very harmful message to be giving to young men who aren't even, or boys who aren't even comfortable with any of this, because it's new to them and it's something they should be able to safely explore and learn about without having so much shame attached to it. And certainly this aspect of purity culture, and actually just purity culture as a whole, interestingly enough, even though it had its own norms and originated from a lot of evangelical Christian background, it really reflects a lot of larger cultural norms. A lot of purity culture concepts are interestingly echoed in the society we live in. To this day, there's very secular versions of all of these things. None of it is necessarily new. I would just say that the purity culture of the 90s, the 2000s, into today just repackaged a lot of old, frankly, patriarchal ideas around sex, around interactions between men and women, especially in a romantic and sexual sense. And it just repackaged it and tried to make it trendy. It made it trendy to experience a lot of shame about one's sexuality, and it's still pushing men and women alike into their respective roles. It's telling women they need to be the moral gatekeepers. They hold all the moral responsibility for something like sex outside of marriage not happening, and it puts some terrible messaging on men and tells them that this is universal male behavior, to be hypersexual, to be aggressive, to hurt women with your sexuality, which I can't imagine as a man what that must feel like, to experience a lot of programming and social messaging and then purity culture that tells you all of that. It is just so damaging that there's so many men, particularly young men, who have had to experience that over and over and over. And again, that's something in larger society absolutely happens. Like, men are absolutely hypersexualized regardless of the particular man in question. It's just understood to be universal male behavior, when not all men are really like that, and they're individuals just like anyone else. The impression I had from this was, if sex happens outside of marriage, no matter the context, no matter if a man and woman were coming together lovingly and consensually, it doesn't matter. If it didn't happen within marriage, there's inherently this element of a man taking advantage of a woman if it's happening outside of marriage. And I just, thinking about that now is really crazy, because I can see how there's ways I'm continuing to unravel influences like that. Because even within an idea like that if sex happens between a man and woman in any context outside of marriage, it's in some way inherently a man taking advantage of a woman, a man in one sense degrading a woman, sets it up that from the onset, men and women cannot be equals in this sort of situation. They cannot consent to each other to be together in a way that they both want to be if it's not happening within marriage. And so it's just assuming that men and women cannot even engage as equals in a situation like that. They can't engage as people who love each other. They can't engage intimately unless if it's happening within marriage. And it's very interesting that in discussing all of this with the purity culture, I just can't help but see how it really is just reflecting back the larger culture we live in many ways, and how topics like these are so stigmatized because we, I think, oftentimes just have such fixed views of things like gender roles, of things of what sex does or should look like, and it doesn't allow for much individuality. And that was definitely the case within purity culture. There was not an allowance for people to individually, autonomously own their sexuality and own, like, however they decided to engage with sex or not engage with it. And taking that autonomy away from people is just probably one of the most unfortunate aspects of all of this purity culture. Need to turn the light on because it's getting dark outside. The interesting thing you might be noticing here is when you present men and women in these very different ways that somehow complement each other in this like twisted way, is that you're putting women up here. Women are put on this pedestal. We are saintly, holy, we're perfect, we're untouchable, like when we're living up to this really, really high moral standard. And you're putting men down, way down here. And you're essentially not expecting anything better of men in these sort of ways. And it's this idea of women being up here, they're innocent, they're holy, they're on a pedestal. Men are down here, and men are trash because they can't be any better. They're animalistic, they're primal, they have urges, etc., etc. And it doesn't acknowledge the humanity of each, because human beings, we are flawed. We can hold a lot of things in error. We make mistakes. We can do all sorts of wrongdoing, right? And so to hold a woman up to the standard that she's almost untouchable and she needs to be put up on this pedestal and remain up there by her moral actions and decisions is to really ironically dehumanize her, because she's not allowed to come down here and just be a human being and maybe be an equal to her male partner, to men around her. And then of course you have the opposite of that, with men are down here and we're not expecting them to act in moral or good ways, at least in the realm of sex and sexuality, which is just, that's so insulting to men, because men are human beings and men are capable of good. And the more that we can and encourage and expect that in men, the more we can uplift them as our fellow human beings. And so I think in both ways, this is why I think the purity culture narrative and things like it in society really, it works. It works in some like very distorted way. It complements each other. The woman is the moral gatekeeper. The man needs to be kept in line because he can't do any better apparently. And I say we need to reject that and acknowledge that men and women alike can make mistakes. We can do wrongdoing. We also can be good human beings, and we need to uplift both and encourage both men and women to be just that, to be good human beings, to make decent, caring choices. And narratives like the ones you find in purity culture and oftentimes in evangelical Christian circles, you don't see that inherent equality. So the idea is either you remain chaste and you just really hold purity in esteem and you follow principles to be abstinent or celibate until marriage, or you're going to be like, as a woman, you're going to be taken advantage of, and guys are going to disrespect you if you engage in any premarital sex in any capacity. And being taught that and thinking about the reality of things, it was just such incomprehensive sex education. Like, I think calling purity culture sex education as a whole is just really a stretch, because there seems to be very little to no science backing up a lot of what was said within it. But I think teaching like younger people that if you didn't choose purity and chastity the way they were specifically presenting it, that the only alternative was engaging in hookup culture, in just all sorts of situations that, depending on the person, not everyone is comfortable with that. Not everyone is going to be comfortable with things like hookups and casual sex. And something like purity culture came along and was pushing back against things like that, which some people, for numerous reasons, might be opposed to being involved in things like that. And there's plenty of valid criticisms out there when it comes to hookup culture and casual sex. And purity culture seemed to recognize that, but take it to such another extreme and make it so that you either were being pure and chaste or you were choosing hookup culture. And that's essentially what purity culture did, when actually it doesn't need to be one or the other. You can still know your own limits and boundaries. You do not need to either be perfectly abstinent and celibate or go crazy in hookup culture and partying. Like, it doesn't need to be one extreme or the other. And I grew up with this idea that the moment you do anything short of abstinence till marriage, that's what's going to happen to you. And there's this irresponsible like partying lifestyle, and it's either that or you remain chaste. And being sold that for a long time too, I think really exemplified how much purity culture was, there was shame, but then underneath that shame and running even deeper was a lot of fear. It's like fear of people actually getting to know their sexuality and getting to know themselves in that sense. And because there's a lot of power to that, not to put sexuality or anything of that realm on a pedestal, but it is to recognize that that is a dimension for people that they can become aware of and learn about. And just like any other aspects of a person, to become more aware of your feelings and preferences and what you are in relation to that aspect of yourself is a very powerful thing. It can be very empowering for a person to explore and gain some self-knowledge when it comes to things like that. And so I think that it's not coincidence that there also seem to be a lot of fear tactics used in presenting purity and chastity concepts, because if you can keep groups of people afraid of this thing and they barely have any experiences, or maybe they have virtually no experiences with it, and you can make them afraid of it and you can shame them for it, like that's just such a dangerous concoction where you can keep people in control and you can regulate what they do and don't do, which I think purity culture might have succeeded at doing for a brief stunt, but I'm really grateful to see a lot of people really working at breaking that down and really leaving that behind. And I'm really happy to see that for other people. I'm really happy to have moved away from a lot of these ideas myself. So those were just some thoughts on parody culture and things I wanted to share with all of you. I would love to hear what your guys' thoughts are about what I said in this video and what your experiences, if any, were with purity culture. I would imagine for a lot of us who have left Christianity or are deconstructing from Christianity, anything like that, probably have had some experiences with this, especially if you were growing up and were a young person in the 90s, 2000s, even the 2010s. So I really look forward to hearing from all of you and what you have to share about this topic, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.